I have the authority of the King of Kings. I am all in all, and above all, so that God himself and I, the vicar of Christ, have but one consistory, and I am able to do almost all that God can do. What therefore can you make of me but God? The reasons for the Reformation, next on So What? Hi, I'm Don Waite.
And I'm Chris Dorman.
And welcome back to So What? Last week we had the opportunity to take a look at the geopolitical condition of Europe leading up to the Reformation, and really what set the stage politically for this man up in Germany that nobody really knew, Martin Luther, this little monk. How could he set off a firestorm that didn't get squelched and this man get killed, right? But more importantly, this week I think we need to take a look at the spiritual condition of the church and really where the hearts of the leaders of the church were during that time, Chris.
Yeah, and we can't speak to every single man who was a leader in the Catholic Church, and that's what we're not trying to do that. But we can say, generally speaking, the highest echelons of the Roman Catholic Church for hundreds of years leading up to the Reformation was completely corrupt to its core. It was really to become a bishop was something people aspired to. They wanted to be bishop, not because they had this great passionate concern to nurture and shepherd God's people, but because being bishop meant a key to financial security, right, a way to provide for your family and your illegitimate children. These celibate clerics who had many illegitimate children, and it was a way to rise up in the ranks, right, in the Catholic Church, to have even more power and have even more opportunity for wealth. And these immoral, corrupt, worldly men elected corrupt, worldly, immoral popes. Mm-hmm. And last week, we looked at the Babylonian captivity of the papacy when the pontiff, the Bishop of Rome, lived in France for almost 70 years. At the end of that period in 1378, the Italians demanded an Italian pope. And there was the vote. At that time, the papacy had just come back to Rome. Yep. So the election was in Rome instead of in France. Right. And most of the cardinals at that time were French. But they felt pressure to elect an Italian. So they did. And they elected an Italian pope, right, who turned out to be a real jerk. And they couldn't stand this guy. So what they did, of course, as godly Christian men, is they submitted to this ruler as their new pope, right, Don? No, that's not what they did.
They did not.
No, they did not.
But they said, we were pressured into voting for this man, so
we made a mistake.
And we need to take a new vote. So you would think because the other pope realized that there was a mistake that he would just step aside, right, Chris?
That's exactly what he did.
No. So now we have two popes.
There were two popes, and there was one back in France and one back in Rome. And this is called it's called the schism, the papal schism. And right, this went on for over 30 years. Right. So over 30 years, there are two popes. Now, if you're not a Catholic, this might not mean anything to you. But to the Catholic, this was super important.
And one of the biggest reasons for that, frankly, was because those who were supportive of the French Pope, for example, the Rome Pope said, you know what? I have an answer for you. I'm going to excommunicate you. I'm going to excommunicate the whole country of France. And so, why is that significant? Because when you're excommunicated, you now are cut off from access to the sacraments. You're cut off from the Eucharist, or communion, if you will, from last rites, from baptism, from penance, all of which in Roman Catholic theology meant that you were being cut off from the grace of Christ. You're being cut off from Christ.
You're cut off from salvation.
Right, your eternal salvation was at stake. Yeah. Based on what pope you're supporting.
That's right. And at one point throughout this period, essentially all of Europe was excommunicated by one pope or the other.
So,
and this went on for a long period, over 30 years.
Right. So the bishops realizing that at some point they need to resolve this.
It's ridiculous.
They call a council, they go up to Pisa, they try to resolve it, right?
But it's important, first of all, that the bishops call the council.
Super important, right?
Super important.
The popes didn't call for this because, of course, they knew what the outcome might be.
One of them was going to lose their job.
Right. So the bishops themselves said, hey, look, we're going to come in and we're going to figure this out.
We have the power to call the council. We have a power to call the council.
Right.
So they did. They called this council in Pisa.
And they voted.
So their solution was, let's do this. Let's fire the two existing popes because we have the power to do that.
Right.
Let's fire those two and let's elect a new pope.
And so those other popes, existing popes, were like, well, gosh, I mean, those guys have the power. We're just going to go ahead and listen to what they have to say, right?
No, that's not what happened at all. No. So then we had three popes. There were three popes after that.
Right.
Yeah.
So it
Three
went from
popes.
bad to worse. It just keeps
did.
getting worse.
It just went worse. It just got worse. So then they said, okay, what are we going to do? Again, the bishops are really, they understand that this cannot continue. So they call another council, the Council of Constance. And this is historically important for another reason. We'll talk about that in another podcast. But at this council, it is resolved. And one person comes out of this, and they have one pope, finally. But what comes out of this is something called the Conciliar movement.
Right.
That the bishops have the power, that they are actually the ones who have the power in the church, not the pope. Okay? Super big deal, because at that point in the church, it really, really wasn't settled. Is the pope essentially like an absolute monarch who cannot be questioned? Or must the pope be in submission to the council? That had not been resolved.
And so ultimately, when we think about this in the larger context of the years leading up to the Protestant Reformation, what we see again is this crumbling away of the authority and power of the Catholic Church, right? Again, setting the stage for somebody like a Martin Luther. Again, you ask yourself, how could this guy who is a nobody not just get squashed when he came up against Rome?
Yeah.
Well, because Rome wasn't what it was.
No, it wasn't what it was at all.
To your point last week or a couple weeks ago, it wasn't the big monolithic power that we think about. At this point, it was broken. And there was a lot of varying ideas about what the church was and what the authority of the Pope was and all this stuff. And so it was not the same.
And it didn't get resolved by the Conciliar movement either.
Right.
The church didn't just go, you know what, yes, the council has the authority. The Pope must be in submission to the council. Because,
in fact.
Because at one point, guess what? We didn't have just one council, we had two councils. There were two different councils meeting at two different parts of the church. One council deposed the sitting Pope and named another Pope. So we had two popes again.
Right.
And the people said, absolutely
we're
not.
done with this.
We're done with this. Forget about it. The Conciliar movement failed. Therefore, the Pope is not in submission to anybody. The council must be in submission to the Pope.
Right.
That's what came out of all of this.
So that being said, although the Pope did claim that kind of power, in real time, he was not able to exert the same level of power that some of his predecessors did, because again, this whittling away at what had happened. And again, people's eyes were being opened to this. They're seeing this happening.
Absolutely.
Right?
People were not oblivious to this. This didn't happen in secret. The popes were above the law. They would flaunt their mistresses and their illegitimate children to everybody. It didn't matter. There was nothing you could do to them. And so once the office of the papacy was resolved, and this guy wasn't fighting for his job, well, then they turned their attention away from fighting for their job to fighting for culture and the arts and expanding their wealth and their power and their prestige. And this went on throughout the Renaissance into the leading up to the time of the Reformation. So once they had settled all these things, they didn't turn their attention back to the Word of God. They turned their attention to amassing more wealth.
Yeah, and people knew it, right?
People knew it.
People were aware of it, that they were not concerned with spiritual matters, but more concerned about funding the arts, funding the architecture, building or improving buildings that were already existing and continuing to. And look, they're glorious buildings, man. When you go over there, I would love to go over and see this stuff, because it's it's on my bucket list. I want to see these great buildings, knowing that they represent such corruption when you think about it. But they really did turn their hearts to worldly things.
They did. And everybody knew what was going on. And everybody understood that, again, the teaching at the time was, to be saved, you must be in submission to Rome. Well, Rome is completely immoral. And so there were people of good conscience going, how can this be? This can't be right. This just can't be right. And people started to speak out. And that's what we're going to start looking at next week. Some of those people who came before Martin Luther, who said, no, this cannot be the gospel. This isn't the gospel. This is not Christ's church. This cannot be. And they set out to change things.
After darkness, light.
Thank you for tuning in, my friends. And I'll talk to you next week.
See you soon.